It is 2023, ladies and gentlemen, and we're going to do something that we may describe as a little bit dangerous. This is Michael from the future, just joking. But what we're going to talk about is the idea of making predictions in 2023, or rather we're going to make some predictions. And I say this is dangerous because humans suck at predictions, right? We're not good at it at all. And as a result, I want to explore not just the predictions themselves, which I think are interesting, a little bit inspired by the All In podcast. If you guys don't check it out, it's really great. They did some predictions for 2023 on their last episode. And what I'm also interested in is, what is it that makes us bad at predictions? What can we do to improve those predictions? And I think really that's part of the idea, right? Somebody might ask, well, if we suck at predictions, why bother making them at all? Some people would say, oh, it's the too hard bucket. The idea of making the predictions to me is not about actually having the predictions come true. We will probably be wrong in a lot of these. However, first of all, it's fun and interesting. But second of all, I think it's really interesting to consider our assumptions going into those predictions and talking about, okay, what was it that I had as my mental model, so that at the end of the year we can reevaluate and say, how was my mental model wrong, so I can correct it and next year do a little bit better. So that's what we're going to talk about today, covering both the mental model side and the prediction side. And in particular, at the end, I'm going to share with you, in my opinion, who the biggest winners and the biggest losers will be in 2023. I would love to hear from you guys. If you were to pause the video, put your predictions, biggest winners, biggest losers, as well as what you think will happen in the world, in the comments below. We will check them afterwards and see who was more similar to others and not. Let's dive in. Number one, I think the interesting thing to start with is the question of, why is it that we are typically really bad at predictions? And I'll give you a little bit of an anecdote about this. There are all these major investment banks who consistently put out reports about what they think the future interest rates will be. And they're pretty much always wrong all the time. So we're talking about enormous numbers of highly educated people with a lot of data who consistently make the wrong decision. There's a great book called Range, and in Range they talk a lot about this. They discuss how experts tend to get things wrong. In fact, the people who are on TV the most tend to do the worst. So you may be familiar with the idea of the inverse Kramer, which Jim Cramer from Mad Money, the famous TV host, it basically bets the opposite of what he does because he's so consistently wrong. And this is a really interesting approach, right? Sometimes you can just take a perspective that consistently is wrong, bet the other way, and you can do all right on it. Anyway, the question is, why is that, right? And I think you can divide this into a few really different concepts. But to illustrate that a little bit, I'm going to start with a first prediction, and then we'll circle back to the, I think, first thing that people tend to get wrong. And so put a pin in that, you can guess, and we'll go and talk about the first prediction. So my first prediction is that the war in Russia will not end. Or I guess that's the war in Ukraine, the Russian-Ukrainian war, will not end in 2023. Clearly I could be wrong about this, but I tend to believe it's going to drag on for a very long time. And one of the reasons that I believe that is that I think things tend to remain the same a lot more than they tend to change. If you were to go back in time, let's just say 500 years, and you were to pick some random person, you were to try and predict their life in the subsequent year, the best prediction would probably be that the previous year accurately described what the next year would be, over and over again. And it just takes time to get things done. I have an expression that I put out, I don't know, maybe a year ago or something, and it is, the problem for those who can see the future is that it always appears closer than it is. So I think we have a tendency to look out and to see change and to see opportunities and possibilities, and we can see the steps to get there, and we kind of compress that space, compress that time into the present to the point where we think it's going to happen much faster than it will. And a good example of this would be, I would say, fusion energy. There's sort of this perpetual idea that fusion is, 20, 30 years away. They had this big milestone that was reached recently at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and people were all excited about it, et cetera. But the truth is that commercial fusion, even from that, is probably 30 to 50 years away, right? So it just takes time for things to happen. And so generally speaking, if you just bet on things remaining the way they are, certainly in the short run, then I think you're generally going to be pretty okay more often than not. So my bet is the war will not end. I think the incentive structure in place is not there for it to end. And so, the Americans are going to keep it going. The Ukrainians are not going to want to give up. Putin is not going to want to give up. And so there just isn't the self-interest for this to end. That being said, like I said, I could always be wrong. So let's go back to one of these first principles for how it is that people get things wrong. And this is the Lindy effect. So those of you who read Nassim Taleb's books, you would be very familiar with the fact that he talks about this a lot. Essentially, the Lindy effect is the idea that the longer something has been in existence, the longer it is likely to be in existence. So for example, 100 years from now, what will the world be like? Well, probably people will still eat with knives, forks, and spoons. Probably people in Asia will still eat with chopsticks. Why? Well, because the longer something has been going on, the more likely it will be longer still. So it's kind of like if it's been going on for a year, it'll probably go on for another year. If it's going on for 10 years, it'll probably go on for another 10 years and so on. Now, obviously that breaks at a certain point, right? It's true until it's not. But just in general, it's an interesting principle to observe. And it's not, it's not a hard law. It's not something that's totally accurate. But this being said, I think it's an interesting observation to make. And so I think that people tend to want to think about change when they should tend to think about things being the same. Okay, what is the next reason that's associated with that I think people tend to get things wrong? Well, I think the other reason, or one of the other reasons that comes in along the same lines is something that Bill Gates said. Bill Gates said, people underestimate what will happen in 1 year, they'll overestimate what will happen in 1 year and underestimate what will happen in 10 years. So when you're thinking about that, why is this? It's because of compounding. And people's brains are designed to work in a linear fashion, not a compound fashion. So you can take what's immediately in front of you and you can extrapolate it, and it doesn't reflect what's ahead of you 10 steps. But at the same time, the opposite is true. Now, I think this gets complicated by the fact that actually things don't move in a compound manner. They move more like an S-curve. And because they move more like an S-curve, no matter where you're at on that line, you tend to track it forward as though it's going to continue at that same level of progress. So hence, you can go back and look at predictions from 50 years ago or however long it was, when people were predicting things like flying cars, space colonies, et cetera, et cetera. Why was that? Well, if you lived through, let's say, the space race, going through the 50s through to the 70s or something, it seemed like there was a lot of progress in that area. And it really ground to a halt for a long time, right? There was basically no progress in the movement to space of people, right? We went and did explorations into space, and until SpaceX came along, things pretty much stagnated. So I think that's a really important thing to note as well, is things progress in S-curves, and hence you should be able to see, all right, in areas where the progress is ticking up, but it's not ticking up super fast, it's probably going to accelerate. But in cases where it's going really fast, it's probably going to decelerate. And we see this, for example, in markets, right? Things that pump a lot are likely to pull back. Things that dump a lot are likely to recover. And you're going to tend to have mean reversion and cycles in place. So with that in mind, what are the next predictions that I have? So my next prediction is going to be that likely inflation will drop to 5% or less by June, okay? Now, why do I believe that? I believe that because you essentially have a roll-off effect. So all you have to do is calculate each month that there will be a variation just by the 1 month that moves forward. It turns out we can track forward that the 2 months that were really high inflation last year were March and May. And so when March and May roll off, that's going, assuming that things kind of resume some sort of equilibrium, which I believe they will, and we certainly are seeing the signs that they will, at the very least, they're going to get knocked off, and that's going to bring us down quite a bit. So it could actually be that we could accelerate beyond this. It's obviously possible that it's not going to be the case. But I think when you look at the overall composition of the CPI basket, what are you going to see? You're going to see, well, how are things going to go up? Wages will probably go up, so that's probably something, but what are we talking about them rising by? Maybe 5-6%, I would say, on the top end. So if you're talking about 5 to 6% wage increases on the top end, that's not super substantial and is not really likely to push things majorly in the area of inflation. Number two, you have food. And certainly when we're talking about groceries, that could drive things up a fair amount. But then again, the question is, how much is that going to happen compared to what's already happened? Number three, you have energy. Energy had gone up a lot and it's come down. China's reopening, so maybe that will create some added demand and push things up. Maybe you'll have some sort of an energy shock out of Russia where there's reduced supply, something like this. So there is possibilities that we would see some sort of upward pressure in those three categories. But those three categories don't amount to, in my opinion, a significant enough amount to compensate, for example, housing. So to give you some idea, energy is 10% of the basket. Let's consider that's a feedstock, so let's try doubling it, say that it's 20%, right? So even if you had a pretty major increase, like 20%, you'd be talking about a 4% net growth in the overall basket. Now, by contrast, housing is 30%. And I suspect with rising interest rates, et cetera, you're going to see broadly housing prices come down. I was just booking trips for some of my staff. We're doing a staff trip, as well as some trips for family, et cetera, going around for the year. And the airfare costs have gotten insane. They're nuts. But I think that's likely to come down as things sort of cool off in sort of the post-COVID era. So realistically, I don't think airline prices are going to continue going up like they have. Certainly, I don't think they're going to go up anymore. You can see vehicle prices have started to come down. Inventories have risen. That's likely to come down. So you can kind of start running across the sectors and say, okay, if you're projecting really high inflation at like over and above 5%, where does that composition come from? So in my opinion, sub 5% by June would be my prediction. We'll see if I'm right or not. Okay. This brings me to the next point, which is related to it, and this is regarding Fed hikes. So what do I think is going to happen with Fed hikes? So I believe the Fed will pause raising rates, but I do not think they will reverse rates. So some people are talking a lot about a Fed pivot and the Fed lowering rates. This brings me to another reason that I think people get things wrong, and this is recency bias, right? So if you just think people's expectations for the last basically 14 years has been a close to zero rate environment. We have, for the first time, gone to interest rates that haven't seen since 2006, right? And so I think a lot of people are conditioned that this is the normal, but the reality is this isn't the normal. By historic terms, we're just reverting to the mean. And so I would expect that to continue in this sort of mean reversion trend. And so I would think that we would probably get a little bit more in the way of rate hikes, and then I think it's highly likely the Fed pauses. And I think it is likely that the Fed holds things steady. Now, why do I think that? A couple of reasons. Number one is the Fed notoriously, and so this is again, things tend to remain the same. The Fed notoriously tends to overact. What do I mean by this? They tend to lower rates too long, keep them, or too far and keep them low too long. Then they tend to raise them too much and keep them high too long. They tend to be slow to act and slow to change. And even from a policy standpoint, they have a lot more tools if they keep rates high. So I believe it is highly likely that the Fed will not lower rates at all in 2023. I think they'll raise them a little bit more, and then they will pause, and that will be that. And that's going to affect a lot of different things in the economy as a whole. Okay, what else can we learn about why people are wrong and why I'm likely wrong about a lot of these predictions? So I think we're really, really bad at the unknown unknowns. And what's happened in the world today is because of the effects of scale, the unknown unknowns can have a really big impact. So unfortunately, I have no way of picking out what are the unknown unknowns that are going to be happening. Who knows, right? There could be something that comes out of left field that I have no idea about. Now, I think the good news is that generally speaking, the unknown unknowns don't show up very often. And because of that, it's partially difficult to predict them. And because of that, I think it's fairly likely that we don't get some huge diametric difference this year. Now we could, right? But they're called tail risks for a reason. And so it's fairly likely, I would say, that we're probably not going to have much of a shocker. I think that people are used to all sorts of shock. Again, they have this recency bias going out there, but realizing that I'm probably completely wrong because this is a massive blind spot for people. So the unknown unknowns, can't know them by definition, and so likely missing something, and that something could be really significant in a fast-moving, globally interconnected world. This brings me to talking about markets for a second. What do you think is going to happen in the markets? So my general belief is that we are going to see somewhat of a rally in risk-on assets. So this is crypto, this is small cap growth stocks, etc. I do not think we will see a return to previous highs. I will sell that rally. But I do think that the move from quite bad to less bad will probably fuel some enthusiasm. And because things are so sold down, there will be sort of like some breathing. And so my expectation is that we will likely see some sort of a rally, but that rally will not sustain. So again, I could be mistaken about that. It's entirely possible, but that would be my guess for what is going to take place here. And part of the reason that I think that, again, is I think people have gone through a period of normalizing what is abnormal. This is the recency bias that we were talking about. Over the last 14 years, you've had Fed money, easy money, zero interest policy, lots of stimulus, etc. And I think when you take that away, you're going to find that, which by the way is the norm, right? Like literally for the longest period of time, that was the norm. We're going to kind of revert to the mean. And mean reversion is going to mean that a lot of these things that had previously just exploded and done extremely well are probably not going to explode and do extremely well. And so that will be one thing that we will have to wait and see. What else do I think will happen? I think that likely, I'm going to kind of break the rules for a second and combine 2023, 2024. I expect 2023, 2024 to be the year of bankruptcies. I think a lot of companies are going to go bankrupt. Why do I think that? I think that because a lot of companies raised money at really high valuations and were burning through that money really quickly in an environment where they were not expected to be profitable and where it was acceptable for them to lose a lot of money in the name of growth. And I think those days are basically over for the next while. There may be a few exceptions, but in general, I think those days are over. And as a result, I think there's a ton of companies that they're getting through right now because they raised a lot of money in 2020, 2021, but they're going to come to the end of that money and they're suddenly going to have to collapse. And this is really going to be healthy. We're going to have a situation where a lot of stuff is weeded out and what's left is going to be quality, and what's left I think is going to do extraordinarily well, but you probably won't see that in 2023. 2023 is probably not the year that you're going to see the big gains from that. So this would be my expectation. We haven't, in my view, seen a lot of these bankruptcies happen yet, and I'm waiting for that to happen because I think it is likely to happen. It may not happen, like I said, in 2023. A bunch of them may be able to kick the can down the road into 2024, but I think 2023, 2024 is going to see the market clearing out a lot, and so by 2025, there should be a much different market space that we are looking at. The next thing that I think is really interesting to explore is what is it that drives the likely outcomes? And I think there is two really interesting points to pay attention to. One is incentives drive outcomes. And so I would expect that many of the incentives that have already started are going to continue. And so, for example, in the world of offshore international things, I expect that we will probably not see a lot of change, meaning that there will probably not be a lot of new programs, and there will probably not be a lot of programs closing. I think what we saw was a big incentive explosion for digital nomad visas, and we got a lot of that, and we're probably going to continue to have that. I think over the last while, there has been a lot of pressure on countries to close down citizenship by investment programs and residency programs, etc. I think that for 2023, we're probably going to take a bit of a pause because people are focused on other things. In the future, that can change, and it will change likely based on the fact that people don't have money or people have money. So that's going to have some sort of a dual impact on the incentives. But I think in general, this will be the case. Likewise, I think there are going to be, over the long term, a lot more digital nomads, a lot more location-independent workers. I don't necessarily think that there will be a big push for that in 2023 because the incentives that were there in 2020 and 2021 are no longer there. So I think the push to back to work is going to probably remain, and you're probably going to remain more or less stable in this regard. What will happen likely, in my opinion, is that if and when things turn bad, then you're going to get a situation where there's cost cutting. And when you have cost cutting, all of a sudden it starts to make sense to employ people remotely where it's cheaper. And that will be where you'll see a bunch of things. I think there was a lot in 2020 that should have showed up, but didn't show up just because of the fact that there was so much easy money that you didn't need to end up in a highly cost competitive area. So I think people who are in the cost competitive area are going to do well over the next while, but I don't think that 2023 is likely to be that big breakthrough year. Now, the other thing that I think really drives the likelihood of outcomes are structural things, right? So I think there are some structural things that are likely to go a particular way or not a particular way. And in this regard, I think we can circle around to our biggest winners and our biggest losers. So who would you say the biggest winner is going to be in 2023? Who would you say is the biggest loser is going to be in 2023? So I'm going to start with the biggest winner. To me, the likely biggest winner are AI startups. Okay, so I don't know any particular player. Obviously, OpenAI is probably going to do really well, but I think Chat GPT has really created this explosion of interest in the AI space, and there's going to be a ton of gold rush going on in there. There's going to be a lot of money allocated. There's going to be a lot of people trying to start up in that space. There's going to be a lot of talent flooding in there, et cetera. I think over time, a lot of those are going to go bankrupt. It's going to get wiped out, et cetera. You'll have to figure out the winners. But I think for this year, for 2023, big winners will be in that space. Okay. Now that brings to what are the big losers, or who is the big loser in 2023? In my opinion, the big losers are going to be those who are who require shorter term real estate capital yields. Okay. So what do I mean by that? So if you are somebody who is, for example, a developer, and you were starting a project in 2021, relying on the pricing in that case, your ability to liquidate that project, I think, just got obliterated. In my opinion, it is highly likely that the housing market gets decimated in terms of pricing. So why is this? Well, it's very simple, because housing is largely driven by affordability, and the affordability, when you go from 0 interest rates to 5.5 interest rates, is going to have a major effect. And right now, people can kind of sit there and think, maybe they're going to lower rates in a little while. I think that is going to get weeded out of the system. Because I think the big losers in particular are going to be commercial real estate holders. And part of the reason for that is that it will make a lot more sense to reallocate funds from commercial real estate into bonds, just for sensible risk to return equations. And so as a result, I think they're going to do really poorly. Now, I'm generalizing in that case, and I shouldn't generalize, because real estate is quite hyper-local, and it can be very asset specific. So it's not any particular real estate holder or any particular real estate market that I think will do badly, but I do think that in general, you're going to see quite a lot when it comes to real estate holders who are reliant on short-term returns. If it's somebody who is a long-term buyer who just buys and holds for 30 years, not a big deal. Those are not the people I'm talking about really losing out. I'm talking about ones who they're flipping, they're doing short-term developments that they need to turn over. They're ones who, for whatever reason, are trying to get some sort of return fairly quickly. I think you're going to have a big, big issue for those people in 2023. It will probably roll over in 2024 as well. So those are my picks for the biggest winner, the biggest loser, and some of the predictions I think will happen in 2023 or not happen, as the situation may be. So definitely let me know what you guys think. Put it in the comments below. If you'd like help with the things that we help here, you can go and check out our website, offshorecitizen.net. You can send us a message through there. We help you with international tax planning, asset protection, Plan Bs, getting residencies, citizenships, forming companies, opening bank accounts, as well as all sorts of structuring and figuring out what is the best solution for you. So you can book a call with me, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Check out some of our other videos, and I will see you on the next video.